Stop for a moment. Not because something is wrong, but because something is finally moving in your favor. God says, what blocked you was not your weakness. It was unseen resistance, and it is being removed. This message is not about conflict. It is about clarity. Here is the truth you need to hear first. God says, not everyone who stood near you stood with you. Some delays were not lessons. Some confusion was not failure. Some exhaustion was not your fault. You were carrying weight that was never yours to hold. Listen closely now. God says, I am removing influences that drained your focus, diluted your confidence, and slowed your progress. This does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like someone stepping away without explanation. Do not chase what is being released. What leaves now was limiting what could arrive. Here is where doubt ends. God says, you were never behind. You were being protected. Protected from premature exposure. Protected from commitments that would cost too much. Protected from people who benefited from your hesitation. The delay was intentional. The clearing is precise. Notice what changes first inside you. God says, your mind becomes quieter. You stop second-guessing every move. You stop replaying conversations. You stop asking for reassurance. Confidence does not arrive as noise. It arrives as stillness. Another sign appears. God says, your energy returns. Motivation rises without pressure. Focus sharpens without effort. You begin to move without forcing yourself. This is not hype. This is alignment restored. Hear this carefully, no fear, no drama. God says, removal is not punishment. It is preparation. When obstacles move, paths do not open randomly. They open specifically for you. What is ahead requires clarity, strength, and self-trust. You are being made ready for it now. Here is your instruction for this phase. God says, stop doubting your readiness. Doubt belonged to the environment you were in, not to who you are becoming. You do not need to prove anything. You need to proceed. This is the quiet assurance you can stand on. God says, when resistance clears, momentum follows naturally. No forcing. No fighting. No explaining. Just forward movement that feels clean. Seal part 1 now. Comment the word, clear. Because it affirms that you accept the removal, trust the process, and are ready to move without looking back. Then type, next part 2. Because the next part reveals what opens immediately after the path is cleared, and how to step into it without hesitation or fear. Stay grounded. What was blocking you is no longer in position. Now movement begins. Part 2, God says, now watch what opens when the path is clear. Take a slow breath. Not to calm fear, but to recognize momentum beginning. God says, when obstruction is removed, direction becomes obvious. This part is not about struggle anymore. It is about flow returning to places that were once blocked. Here is what changes first after the path is cleared. God says, decisions stop feeling heavy. You no longer feel stuck between options. You no longer delay because of confusion. You no longer ask everyone else what to do. Clarity replaces hesitation quietly, but completely. Understand this deeply. God says, what opens next will feel familiar, not foreign. Because it was always meant for you. It is not sudden luck. It is alignment finally catching up. You are not stepping into something new. You are stepping into what was postponed. Here is the shift you may already notice. God says, your self-trust is rebuilding from the inside. Not loud confidence. Not overexcitement. But a steady knowing that says, I can handle what comes next. This is strength that lasts. Another door begins to open. God says. Support appears without you asking for it. A person reaches out. An opportunity presents itself. A situation resolves itself. Not because you chased, but because resistance no longer blocks the way. Pay attention to this instruction now. God says. Move when the opening feels peaceful, not urgent. Urgency belongs to fear. Peace belongs to alignment. If the opportunity feels grounded, stable, and honest, it is meant to be explored. Here is where breakthrough becomes guaranteed. God says. You are no longer carrying internal conflict. When the mind and heart agree, progress accelerates naturally. What once required effort now requires only presence. Something important is being restored. God says. Your confidence is returning without ego. You stop proving. You stop defending. You stop shrinking. You stand comfortably in who you are becoming. That is real power. Here is the reminder you need right now. God says. Do not rush to fill empty space. Space was created on purpose. Let what belongs there arrive properly. Not everything needs immediate replacement. Some things need room to enter fully. This is the promise attached to this part. God says. When the path clears, progress becomes inevitable. Not forced. Not fragile. Not temporary. Stable. Sustained. Aligned. Seal part 2 now. Comment the word, forward. Because it affirms that you are ready to move ahead without carrying doubt, fear, or old resistance. Then type, next part 3. Because the next part reveals the exact inner shift that locks this breakthrough in place, so nothing can reverse it again. Stay present. The way forward is no longer blocked. It is responding to you. Part 3, God says, this inner shift makes your breakthrough permanent. Be still again, just for a moment. Not because momentum has slowed, but because this is the point where everything locks into place. God says. External change lasts only when the inner foundation is set. This part is not about what opens. It is about what stays open. Here is the shift that changes everything. God says. You stop seeking permission to be who you already are. You no longer wait to be chosen. You no longer ask if it's your turn. You no longer doubt whether you deserve progress. You step forward as if access was always yours. Because it was. Listen carefully now. God says. Your breakthrough is not fragile. It does not depend on someone's mood. It does not rely on perfect conditions. It does not vanish when challenges appear. It is rooted in clarity, not circumstance. This is why doubt can no longer survive here. God says. You finally trust your own direction. Not because everything is guaranteed, but because you are grounded. Even if something shifts, you know how to adjust without panic. That is mastery. Another layer settles into place. God says. You stop revisiting old versions of yourself. No more replaying past mistakes. No more explaining your growth to those who haven't changed. No more returning to environments that no longer fit. You honor your evolution by staying present. Here is what permanently changes your path. God says. Your standards rise quietly. You do not argue. You do not negotiate your peace. You simply choose better. What cannot meet your standard fades without resistance. Pay attention to this instruction. God says. Protect your focus. Not everything needs your energy. Not every invitation deserves a response. Not every opinion requires consideration. Focus is the guardrail that keeps your breakthrough intact. Here is how you know the shift is complete. God says. Your reactions soften. You respond instead of react. You pause instead of panic. You choose instead of drift. This calm is not indifference. It is control. Understand this promise fully. God says. What is built on inner authority cannot be undone by outer resistance. This is why the breakthrough is guaranteed. Not because nothing will test you, but because nothing can destabilize you now. Here is the final grounding truth of this part. God says. You are no longer moving toward your breakthrough. You are standing inside it. What happens next is expansion, not survival. Seal part 3 now. Comment the word rooted. Because it affirms that your breakthrough is grounded, stable, and no longer reversible. Then type next part 4. Because the next part reveals how to expand safely after breakthrough, without losing peace, balance, or direction. Remain steady. This is not a moment. This is a new foundation. Part 4, God says, now expand, but do not abandon your center. Stay with this moment. Not because something fragile is happening, but because something powerful is unfolding correctly. God says. Expansion must be guided, or it becomes noise. This part is about growth after breakthrough. How to rise without losing yourself. Here is the first truth of expansion. God says. More opportunity does not require more urgency. Just because doors open does not mean you must run through all of them. Aligned expansion feels steady. Rushed expansion feels chaotic. Choose steadiness. Notice this change already happening. God says. Your awareness sharpens. You begin to sense what fits. And what simply looks good. You recognize the difference between opportunity and distraction. Growth and overload. Expansion and escape. This discernment protects your peace. Another important instruction. God says. Do not grow wider before you grow deeper. Depth stabilizes width. Foundation supports reach. Build strength internally. Before taking on more externally. This is how growth lasts. Here is what healthy expansion looks like. God says. You grow without abandoning your values. You do not compromise integrity to move faster. You do not sacrifice rest to appear productive. You do not trade peace for praise. If expansion demands self-betrayal, it is not aligned. Pay attention to this subtle sign. God says. Your pace becomes intentional. You move quickly where clarity exists. You slow down where alignment needs confirmation. This balance keeps momentum clean. Another layer unfolds here. God says. Your environment begins to match your inner state. Conversations improve. Conflicts reduce. Support systems strengthen. Not because others changed, but because your standards did. Here is a warning given with care. God says. Do not explain your growth to those committed to misunderstanding you. Explanation drains energy. Results speak more clearly. Silence protects expansion. This is the promise attached to this phase. God says. When you expand with wisdom, nothing collapses. You will not burn out. You will not lose yourself. You will not regret your progress. Because your center remains intact. Here is the grounding reminder. God says. You are not building faster, you are building correctly. Correct growth outlasts fast growth. Seal part 4 now. Comment the word balanced. Because it affirms that you are ready to expand without losing peace, clarity, or alignment. Then type next part 5. Because the next part reveals the final protection that keeps your breakthrough secure, even when attention, success, or pressure increases. Stay centered. Growth is happening. And this time, it is sustainable. Part 5, God says, this final protection keeps your breakthrough secure. Settle into this moment. Not to pause progress, but to seal it. God says, what I establish, I also protect. This part is about stability under visibility. What keeps your breakthrough intact when attention grows, demands increase, and pressure returns? Here is the protection most people overlook. God says, humility is not shrinking. It is staying teachable. When success arrives, ego tries to take the wheel. When recognition grows, comparison tries to creep in. Stay teachable. It keeps wisdom flowing. Understand this clearly. God says, attention does not equal assignment. Not every invitation is aligned. Not every voice deserves access. Not every request requires a yes. Protection begins with discernment. Here is the internal guardrail that matters now. God says, keep your private life nourished. Public strength is sustained by private alignment. Silence restores clarity. Solitude resets intention. What you protect in private determines what you can handle in public. Another safeguard activates here. God says, return to your why. When pressure increases, purpose steadies you. Ask, why did I begin? What do I stand for? What will I not sacrifice? Purpose keeps you honest when options multiply. Watch for this important shift. God says, your success will attract opinions. Some will praise. Some will question. Some will misunderstand. You do not need to manage perceptions. You need to manage alignment. Here is the boundary that preserves peace. God says, do not negotiate your non-negotiables. Rest. Integrity. Values. Health. What cost you peace before will cost you more now. Choose wisely. Another truth that protects longevity. God says, consistency beats intensity. You do not need dramatic effort. You need sustainable rhythm. Small, aligned steps. Repeated faithfully. Outlast emotional bursts. Here is the promise attached to this protection. God says, what is guarded by wisdom cannot be stolen by pressure. You will not lose yourself. You will not drift off course. You will not collapse under growth. Because you are anchored. Final confirmation for this part. God says, your breakthrough is no longer exposed, it is established. What comes next is not survival. It is stewardship. Seal part 5 now. Comment the word secure. Because it affirms that you are ready to protect your progress with wisdom, balance, and self-respect. Then type next part 6. Because the next part reveals how to steward what you've received, so growth continues without strain, fear, or loss of direction. Remain grounded. What has been given is protected. And it will last. Part 6, God says, now steward what you've been given with wisdom. Pause here, not to slow down, but to recognize responsibility awakening. God says, breakthrough is a gift. Stewardship is the calling that follows. This part is not about receiving more. It is about handling well what is already in your hands. Here is the shift that separates momentary success from lasting growth. God says, you move from wanting increase to honoring what exists. Gratitude stabilizes expansion. Care multiplies impact. Attention preserves value. What you respect, grows. Understand this principle deeply. God says, stewardship is quiet consistency. It is not constant celebration. It is not chasing the next high. It is daily alignment with purpose. You show up even when no one is watching. That is how foundations strengthen. Another truth unfolds now. God says, you will be tested with maintenance, not miracles. Can you remain steady when excitement fades? Can you protect rhythm when life becomes busy? Can you stay aligned without constant confirmation? This is maturity. Here is a key instruction for this phase. God says, simplify where complexity drains you. Not everything needs optimization. Not every process needs expansion. Not every commitment needs renewal. Simplicity restores clarity. Notice what stewardship begins to heal. God says, your relationship with time improves. You stop rushing. You stop procrastinating. You begin honoring time as a resource, not an enemy. Time starts working with you. Another safeguard activates here. God says, care for your energy, not just your output. Burnout is not proof of dedication. Exhaustion is not evidence of purpose. Rest is not retreat. Rest is renewal. Here is how you know stewardship is working. God says, peace remains even as responsibility increases. You are busy, but not overwhelmed. Focused, but not tense. Committed, but not depleted. This balance is intentional. A deeper layer settles in. God says, you begin choosing quality over quantity. Fewer commitments. Clearer priorities. Stronger results. What you build becomes more refined. Here is the promise for this part. God says, what is stewarded with care will be trusted with more. Increase follows responsibility naturally. You do not chase growth. Growth responds to integrity. Final grounding truth for part 6. God says, you are no longer proving readiness. You are demonstrating reliability. This is how trust is established. Seal part 6 now. Comment the word steward. Because it affirms that you are ready to honor, protect, and manage what has been entrusted to you. Then type, next part 7. Because the next part reveals how to receive even greater responsibility without fear, while remaining calm, grounded, and aligned. Stay present. What you carry now is preparing you for what comes next. Part 7, God says, you are ready for more, without fear. Stay grounded here. This is not a warning. This is a confirmation. God says, greater responsibility is approaching because your foundation can hold it. This part is about what happens when life begins to trust you with more. More influence, more decisions, more impact. Here is the first truth you must understand. God says, fear appears when growth is misunderstood. Fear does not mean you are unprepared. Fear means you are standing at the edge of expansion. You are not being overwhelmed. You are being invited upward. Listen carefully now. God says, you will not receive more than your nervous system can handle. This is why calm has been cultivated first. This is why clarity came before speed. This is why discipline replaced urgency. You are internally regulated for what is next. Here is how greater responsibility arrives. God says, it comes disguised as trust. Someone relies on your judgment. A situation requires your leadership. A decision waits for your direction. Not because you demanded authority, but because you demonstrated stability. Another truth unfolds here. God says, you no longer collapse under pressure, you organize under it. You prioritize instead of panic. You delegate instead of carry everything. You pause instead of react. Pressure no longer controls you. It clarifies you. This is an important instruction for this phase. God says, lead from alignment, not control. You do not need to micromanage. You do not need to dominate outcomes. You do not need to prove strength. True authority feels calm, not loud. Watch this shift closely. God says, your confidence becomes quiet but unmistakable. You speak with intention. You act with restraint. You choose with discernment. Others feel safe around your leadership. Because you are anchored. Another layer of readiness locks in. God says, you stop confusing responsibility with burden. Responsibility is influence with purpose. Burden is weight without meaning. What is coming carries meaning. That is why it will not crush you. Here is a powerful reassurance. God says, you are not alone at this level. Support systems adjust. Guidance appears. Wisdom becomes accessible when needed. You will not be abandoned in expansion. Understand this promise deeply. God says, when responsibility is accepted with humility, capacity increases naturally. You grow into it as you go. You do not need to know everything now. You need only to remain aligned. Final grounding truth of Part 7. God says, you are not stepping into pressure, you are stepping into purpose. And purpose always strengthens those who honor it. Seal Part 7 now. Comment the word ready. Because it affirms that you accept greater responsibility without fear, panic, or self-doubt. Then type next Part 8. Because the next part reveals the final mindset that ensures everything you build from here becomes legacy, not stress, not struggle, but lasting impact. Remain steady. What is ahead is meaningful. And you are prepared to carry it. Part 8, God says, build what outlives the moment. Be still again. Not because movement has stopped. But because meaning has arrived. God says, what you build from this place is no longer just for you. This part is about legacy. Not fame, not speed, not applause. But impact that remains steady when emotions fade. Here is the mindset that changes everything. God says, think beyond urgency. Choose endurance. Urgency creates noise. Endurance creates structure. You are no longer reacting to life. You are shaping it deliberately. Listen closely to this truth. God says, legacy is built in ordinary moments done with integrity. How you speak when no one is watching. How you decide when shortcuts appear. How you treat people when power is available. These moments outlast achievements. Another shift settles in now. God says, you stop measuring success by recognition. You measure it by stability, consistency, alignment, peace maintained over time. When recognition comes, it finds you grounded. Here is the instruction that protects legacy. God says, choose what you are willing to repeat for years. If it burns you out in months, it will not sustain you long term. Build rhythms you can live inside of. Not performances you must recover from. Notice how your decisions evolve. God says, you prioritize long-term trust over short-term wins. You keep your word. You honor commitments. You correct mistakes quickly. Trust compounds quietly. And becomes influence later. Another important realization appears. God says, legacy requires patience with process. Some results grow slowly. Some impact is invisible at first. Some seeds take time to surface. Do not dig them up too early. Here is the emotional maturity that seals this phase. God says, you stop needing validation to stay consistent. You continue even when praise fades. You remain focused even when excitement dips. You stay aligned even when progress feels subtle. This is discipline rooted in purpose. Watch this transformation carefully. God says, your presence becomes stabilizing to others. People feel calmer around you. Decisions feel clearer near you. Conflict softens in your presence. This is leadership without force. Here is the promise attached to legacy. God says, "What is built with integrity will protect those who come after you. Your work will support others. Your choices will create pathways. Your steadiness will become a reference point." This is impact beyond yourself. Final grounding truth of Part 8. God says, "You are no longer chasing results. You are establishing values. Values guide generations. Results come and go." Seal Part 8 now. Comment the word legacy. Because it affirms that you are choosing depth over noise, endurance over urgency, and integrity over shortcuts. Then type next Part 9. Because the next part reveals how to remain grounded when legacy begins to attract attention, expectations, and responsibility from others. Stay steady. What you are building now will last longer than a moment. Part 9, God says, stay grounded when attention finds you. Remain centered here. This phase arrives quietly. But it changes how the world responds to you. God says, attention will come, not because you asked for it, but because alignment is visible. This part is about remaining anchored when eyes turn toward you. When expectations rise. When people begin to project onto your path. Here is the first truth you must hold firmly. God says, attention does not define you, alignment does. Praise can inflate. Criticism can distract. Both can pull you away from your center if you let them. You are not here to perform. You are here to remain true. Listen carefully now. God says, not everyone who notices you understands you. Some will admire the outcome but not the discipline. Some will want access to the fruit but not the process. Some will misunderstand your silence as distance. You do not owe clarity to every observer. This is a crucial boundary for this phase. God says, let your life speak louder than your explanations. You do not need to justify your pace. You do not need to defend your choices. You do not need to narrate your growth. Consistency answers questions better than words. Notice how grounding actually works here. God says, return often to what keeps you human. Daily routines. Honest reflection. Quiet moments away from noise. Grounding is not isolation. It is intentional simplicity. Another truth becomes important now. God says, expectations will try to rush you. People may want faster results. Clearer answers. Bigger moves. But speed chosen to satisfy others creates imbalance. You move at the pace of integrity, not demand. Here is how you protect your inner state. God says, filter input carefully. Not every opinion deserves space. Not every request deserves energy. Not every voice deserves weight. Wisdom is selective listening. Watch for this subtle temptation. God says, do not confuse visibility with obligation. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to remain private. Presence does not require constant availability. Here is the grounding reminder that stabilizes everything. God says, your value does not increase with attention, it was already complete. Attention may come and go. Alignment remains. This truth keeps you steady. Another layer of maturity settles in. God says, you stop needing to be understood to stay committed. Misinterpretation no longer shakes you. Silence no longer feels threatening. You trust your direction even without applause. This is internal authority. Here is the promise attached to this phase. God says, when you remain grounded, attention becomes influence, not pressure. Influence guided by calm creates trust, not tension. Final grounding truth of Part 9. God says. Stay rooted in who you are when no one is watching, that is where your strength lives. Everything else is temporary. Seal Part 9 now. Comment the word, grounded. Because it affirms that you choose stability over noise, alignment over approval, and truth over performance. Then type, next part 10. Because the next part reveals the final inner mastery that allows you to walk forward without fear of loss, failure, or regression. Remain centered. You are holding this level well. And more clarity is coming. Part 10, God says, you are no longer afraid of losing. Settle into this truth. This is not about courage alone. This is about freedom. God says. Fear of loss controlled you only when you believed what you had was fragile. This part is about inner mastery. The moment you stop gripping life tightly. And start walking forward with trust. Here is the first realization that changes everything. God says. What is truly yours cannot be taken from alignment. You no longer operate from scarcity. You no longer cling to outcomes. You no longer compromise to protect what is unstable. What remains now is real. Listen closely to this internal shift. God says. You stop fearing endings. Endings no longer signal failure. They signal completion. You understand that release makes room. That closure restores energy. That movement requires change. Another layer of mastery locks in here. God says. You begin trusting your ability to rebuild. Even if something changes. Even if something ends. Even if something surprises you. You know you can respond with clarity. This confidence is quiet and powerful. Notice how decision-making transforms. God says. You choose alignment over attachment. You no longer stay where growth is stalled. You no longer invest where respect is missing. You no longer fear walking away when truth is clear. You choose peace without apology. Here is a critical internal safeguard. God says. Detachment is not indifference, it is trust. You still care. You still commit. You still give your best. But you do not collapse if outcomes shift. This keeps your heart open and steady. Another truth emerges now. God says. You stop measuring security by control. Control exhausts you. Trust stabilizes you. You allow life to meet you halfway. Instead of forcing certainty. Watch how resilience deepens. God says. Loss no longer threatens your identity. Your worth is no longer tied to roles, results, or recognition. Your identity is rooted in alignment. This is emotional sovereignty. Here is the promise attached to this mastery. God says. When fear of loss dissolves, creativity expands. You take cleaner risks. You move with openness. You allow new paths to appear. Freedom fuels innovation. Final grounding truth of Part 10. God says. You are not walking forward defensively, you are walking forward freely. Nothing behind you controls you now. Seal Part 10 now. Comment the word, free. Because it affirms that you release fear of loss and choose trust, clarity, and forward movement. Then type, next part 11. Because the next part reveals the final alignment that brings peace, purpose, and momentum into one unified direction. Remain open. What comes next is not heavy. It is harmonious. Part 11, God says, now everything moves in one direction. Be present here. This is not a peak. This is integration. God says. When peace, purpose, and momentum align, life stops pulling you in pieces. This part is about unity. When who you are, what you do, and where you're going. Begin moving together. Here is the first sign alignment has completed its work. God says. Your decisions feel lighter. Not because choices are easy, but because conflict inside you has quieted. You no longer argue with yourself. You no longer second-guess clarity. You no longer delay what feels right. Inner agreement creates forward motion. Listen carefully to this truth. God says, peace is no longer something you protect, it is something you carry. Chaos can exist around you, without entering you. You respond instead of react. You observe instead of absorb. This is emotional leadership. Another deep shift settles in. God says, your purpose stops feeling distant. It no longer lives in the future. It lives in daily choices. How you speak. How you work. How you treat people. How you treat yourself. Purpose becomes practical. Here is the clarity that stabilizes momentum. God says, you stop forcing progress. You move when it's time. You pause when it's wise. You act when alignment confirms. Effort becomes efficient. Motion becomes intentional. Notice how your energy changes. God says, you spend less time explaining and more time executing. Your life becomes cleaner. Your words become fewer. Your actions become clearer. This is focus refined. Another layer of harmony appears. God says, your goals and values stop competing. Success no longer requires sacrifice of peace. Growth no longer demands exhaustion. Achievement no longer costs integrity. Everything fits. Here is an important instruction for this phase. God says, protect simplicity. Complexity drains alignment. Simplicity preserves momentum. Do fewer things better. Choose clarity over clutter. Watch how confidence now operates. God says, you trust your timing. You are not late. You are not behind. You are not rushing. You are on schedule for your own life. Here is the promise attached to unified alignment. God says, when direction is clear, resistance weakens. Obstacles still appear. But they no longer confuse you. You know where you're going. So you move through, not around. Final grounding truth of part 11. God says, you are no longer divided within, and that is your greatest strength. Unity creates power. Power creates movement. Movement creates impact. Seal part 11 now. Comment the word aligned. Because it affirms that your peace, purpose, and momentum are now moving as one. Then type next part 12. Because the next part reveals the final state, how to live forward without striving, without fear, and without losing connection to yourself. Stay present. This is not an ending. This is a way of living. Part 12, God says, live without striving. Walk without fear. Stay here for a moment. This is not instruction anymore. This is embodiment. God says, you are no longer chasing life, life is meeting you. This part is about the final inner state. Effort without strain, movement without anxiety, faith without force. Here is the truth that settles everything. God says, striving ends when trust becomes natural. You stop pushing doors. You stop over-explaining. You stop proving readiness. What is meant for you recognizes you now. Listen deeply to this shift. God says, you move with intention, not urgency. Urgency comes from fear of missing out. Intention comes from clarity of direction. You know where you're going. So you walk. You don't rush. Another transformation completes here. God says, you no longer confuse stillness with stagnation. Rest becomes productive. Silence becomes instructive. Waiting becomes active trust. You understand timing as wisdom. Here is the calm authority that now lives in you. God says. You respond from center, not from emotion. You feel deeply. But feelings no longer steer you. Clarity leads. Values decide. Peace confirms. This is inner sovereignty. Notice how effort now feels different. God says. Your work flows instead of draining you. Because you are no longer divided. Because resistance has softened. Because alignment conserves energy. You do not finish depleted. You finish fulfilled. Another sacred realization anchors here. God says. You trust outcomes without obsessing over them. You do your part. You release control. You allow results to arrive in their time. This is faith matured into peace. Watch how fear dissolves now. God says. Fear cannot survive where trust is consistent. Fear needs uncertainty to live. You now live in alignment. Even the unknown feels navigable. Here is the lifestyle that forms from this state. God says. You live forward without abandoning yourself. You grow without self-betrayal. You succeed without self-neglect. You lead without losing humility. This is wholeness. Another truth seals this phase. God says. You stop asking, am I enough? Because your life answers it daily. Peace is evidence. Consistency is evidence. Integrity is evidence. Here is the promise that carries you onward. God says. When striving ends, grace multiplies. Support appears naturally. Opportunities align cleanly. Progress feels cooperative. Life begins to work with you. Final grounding truth of Part 12. God says. You are not becoming, you are being. And being aligned is the highest form of movement. Seal Part 12 now. Comment the word trust. Because it affirms that you choose flow over force, faith over fear, and alignment over striving. Then type, next part 13. Because the next part reveals how to remain in this state long-term, without slipping back into old patterns when life challenges return. Remain calm. Remain present. This way of living is now yours. Part 13, God says, remain steady when life tests you again. Stay with this moment. This is not about avoiding challenges. This is about staying anchored when they arrive. God says. Alignment is proven by how you respond under pressure, not by how peaceful life feels when it is easy. This part reveals how to maintain your state. When old patterns try to return. When stress knocks unexpectedly. When emotions attempt to take the wheel again. Here is the first truth you must remember. God says. Challenges returning does not mean you are regressing. Growth does not remove storms. Growth changes how storms move through you. You are not back at the beginning. You are standing on higher ground. Listen carefully now. God says. Old triggers may appear, but they no longer control you. You may notice familiar emotions. You may feel old impulses rise. But now, there is space between feeling and reaction. That space is mastery. This is the key practice that sustains alignment. God says. Pause before responding. Not to suppress emotion. But to allow clarity to surface. One pause can prevent a spiral. One breath can restore direction. Another stabilizing truth unfolds. God says. Consistency matters more than intensity. You do not need dramatic effort to stay aligned. You need repeatable habits. Simple routines. Clear boundaries. Regular self-checks. Small actions protect big peace. Here is how you recognize slipping patterns early. God says. Notice when urgency replaces intention. Urgency pushes. Intention guides. When you feel rushed, return to basics. When you feel scattered, simplify. Alignment is restored by returning, not forcing. Another important reminder anchors here. God says, you are allowed to reset without shame. Alignment is not fragile. It is forgiving. One off day does not erase growth. One mistake does not undo maturity. Correction is strength, not failure. Watch how resilience deepens now. God says, you stop personalizing difficulty. Challenges are no longer proof that something is wrong with you. They are signals inviting adjustment. You adapt instead of collapse. Here is the boundary that protects your state. God says, guard your input. What you consume mentally shapes what you experience emotionally. Reduce noise. Choose clarity. Limit unnecessary exposure. Peace is maintained intentionally. Another layer of grounding settles in. God says, you trust your ability to recover quickly. Recovery time shortens. Clarity returns faster. Balance is restored sooner. This is emotional efficiency. Here is the promise for this phase. God says, the more you practice alignment, the more natural it becomes. What once required effort becomes instinct. This is how new identity forms. Final grounding truth of part 13. God says, you are not fragile, you are practiced. And practice creates stability. Seal part 13 now. Comment the word steady. Because it affirms your commitment to remain grounded, aware, and aligned even when life tests you again. Then type, next part 14. Because the next part reveals how this steady alignment begins to influence others, and how to lead without pressure, ego, or exhaustion. Remain centered. What you hold now is becoming a source of strength beyond you. Part 14, God says, your steadiness will guide others. Remain calm here. This phase is subtle, but powerful. God says, you are not meant to convince anyone. Your alignment will speak for you. This part is about influence without effort. How your inner steadiness begins to affect others. Without you trying to lead, fix, or save anyone. Here is the first truth of this level. God says, people feel safety before they understand wisdom. They may not know why they trust you. They may not articulate what draws them in. But your presence lowers tension. Your consistency creates relief. This is leadership through regulation. Listen carefully now. God says, you do not lead by instructions, you lead by example. How you pause before reacting. How you choose clarity over drama. How you remain grounded when things go wrong. Others notice what you normalize. Another important shift appears. God says, you stop absorbing other people's chaos. You listen without carrying. You care without collapsing. You support without rescuing. Compassion stays clean at this level. Here is the boundary that protects your energy. God says, you are responsible for your state, not for managing everyone else's emotions. You can guide without controlling. You can help without overextending. You can be present without self-sacrifice. This keeps influence sustainable. Notice how guidance flows now. God says, people come to you when they are ready, not when you chase them. Your calm becomes an invitation. Your clarity becomes a reference point. You are not pulling anyone forward. You are standing steady so others can orient themselves. Another layer of wisdom settles in. God says, you speak less, but your words carry more weight. Because they are not rushed. Because they are not emotional. Because they are not reactive. Silence sharpens discernment. Here is a key reminder for this phase. God says, do not shrink to make others comfortable. Your growth may challenge people. Your boundaries may feel unfamiliar to them. This is not arrogance. This is evolution. Watch how leadership now feels. God says, it does not drain you. Because you are not forcing outcomes. Because you are not carrying responsibility that is not yours. You lead by being regulated. Not by being exhausted. Another truth anchors here. God says, your influence expands when you stay authentic. No performance. No spiritual superiority. No pressure to appear perfect. Authenticity builds trust faster than authority. Here is the promise attached to this phase. God says, when you remain steady, others remember what steadiness feels like. And that memory guides them, even when you are not present. Final grounding truth of part 14. God says, you are becoming a quiet reference point, proof that peace and progress can coexist. Seal part 14 now. Comment the word anchor. Because it affirms that you choose to remain steady without absorbing chaos, leading without pressure, and influencing without ego. Then type, next part 15. Because the next part reveals the final transformation, how this alignment opens doors, timing, and opportunities without forcing anything at all. Remain calm. Remain true. What comes next arrives naturally. Part 15, God says, what is meant for you now walks toward you. Be present for this. This is not a climax of noise. This is arrival through stillness. God says, you are no longer chasing doors. Doors are recognizing you. This final part is about receiving without force. How alignment unlocks timing, opportunity, and provision. Without struggle, without anxiety, without proving. Here is the truth that completes the journey. God says, when you stop striving, you become visible to what is aligned. You are not overlooked. You are being prepared. Now your energy is clear enough for the right things to find you. Listen carefully. God says, what arrives now does not require you to betray yourself. No compromise of values. No exhaustion disguised as opportunity. No chaos disguised as excitement. What comes fits your peace. Another powerful realization settles in. God says, timing responds to readiness, not desperation. You are ready because you are steady. You are grounded. You are aligned. You are no longer rushing. This readiness speaks louder than effort ever could. Watch how opportunities appear now. God says, they arrive through clarity, not confusion. Clear conversations. Clean invitations. Aligned collaborations. You no longer need to decode mixed signals. Here is the shift in how you receive. God says, you receive without guilt. You no longer feel the need to explain why you deserve good things. You no longer downplay blessings. You no longer fear loss the moment something arrives. Receiving becomes natural. Another truth locks in. God says, you stop chasing validation because alignment validates itself. You trust what feels right. You trust what stays consistent. You trust what supports your growth. External approval becomes optional. Notice how effort now works. God says, you act when guided, not when pressured. Movement feels clean. Decisions feel calm. Progress feels cooperative. Life is no longer resisting you. Here is the promise fulfilled. God says, what enters your life now is sustainable. It does not burn you out. It does not destabilize you. It does not pull you away from yourself. It grows with you. Another grounding reminder seals this. God says, you are no longer afraid to receive more, because you trust yourself to hold it. Capacity has expanded. Wisdom has matured. Stability is present. You are ready. Final truth of the entire journey. God says. This was never about becoming someone else. It was about returning to who you truly are. And now,